Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. First day of the semester. This is actually kind of a very rapidly planned seminar here. The SIGBI meetings are going on now down in West Palm, and on Sunday we had a biology of the crocodilian symposium down there, and Jeff Lang and his wife Gretchen come down for that, and they were going to spend a week in Florida, so I asked them if they'd mind coming by Gainesville and catching us up on the work that Jeff's been doing. So I've known Jeff since 1980. Already then he probably has no recollection of that. It was just some grad school newbie work at a HERP meeting, but he was already doing really important crocodilian work back then. He had done his master's. He got his master's in 1971 at the University of North Dakota, and a PhD in 1977 at the University of Minnesota, and then he did a postdoc in Australia with Harry Messel, right?
Right.
In Webby, Maine, and
Gordon Gregg as well.
And Gordon Gregg also, all prominent croc people. And Jeff has been a leading crocodilian biologist for all of these years, one of the top croc people in the world. He's worked on other things as well. His primary interests are in thermal biology and especially temperature-dependent sex determination. He's worked in crocodilians and turtles with that. In the early 2000s, Jeff and Gretchen realized that there was no reason for them to spend their lives freezing in North Dakota, so they mindfully packed up and moved to Minnesota. Jeff's an amazing biologist and has proved that you can lead a long and productive career studying crocodilians in North Dakota without studying fossil crocodilians. He's done work all over the world. And so he's going to talk today to us about work he's been doing over the past 7 or so years at least now, right? He's worked in India before, but in the past 7 or 8 years, he's been studying gharial on the Chambal River. And, you know, one of the problems we have with crocodilian conservation work, crocodilian ecology, is field work. We all know field work is difficult. You know, it's hard when you're mucking around in the water and mud, and animals are trying to rip your kneecap off, and it's hard for people to do that even in the short term. But to do this decade after decade. Off the plane in Delhi at 10:30 in the morning, it was 116 degrees out. And Jeff's out there every day in the field doing this. It's amazing stuff. So I'll let him tell you about the gharial and Chambal River.
Thanks, Ken, and I'm really delighted to be here. This has always been one of the sort of epicenters of crocodilian conservation and biology as well. So it's fun to share this story. I'm going to tell a story that sort of was dictated by a real kind of conservation need, which I'll explain. But we sort of backed into a situation that became more and more interesting as time went on. So there's sort of two parts to this, and both of them are the reasons that I've kept doing it. This is a species that's critically endangered, so there's a real strong conservation need to know information that might be of use in management and conservation. But it's also a story about a species that's particularly distinctive and quite spectacular, I think, especially in some of its behavioral features. So this is the image I use. This is a 5 meter plus male gharial. He's identified as a male because he has a big bulbous cartilaginous growth on his nose. It resembles a pot, and so the Hindi word for pot is the basis for the name gharial. So it basically is this crocodilian in which the males, the mature males, have a pot on the end of their nose. And this image, actually, I took the time to actually count all these little guys, or try to, and it's about 300 little hatchlings that are evident here. The work was done with an Indian naturalist. He's a local kid who grew up on the river. Now has spent the last 7-8 years learning how to take notes, do photography, and using these sort of innate skills that he had, having grown up on the river and being very comfortable with the Chambo River, to help us really learn what's going on. And he's out day after day. And really the reason that we've continued the study as long as we have, because it's very much been a collaboration and a huge amount of effort on his part in the field. He took this photo, by the way, which is the one that I often use. So this is a male. It's a little clearer here, a different male with some small young. And I just want to mention a couple of people. Basu, Drovajoti Basu, is an Indian worker who spent a good deal of his life as a junior clerk, essentially, in the Forest Department in UP, but was largely responsible for the early conservation efforts with gharial, setting up a head starting program, collecting eggs, releasing animals into the Chambo, and for all I know, some of the adults that we're looking at were actually animals that he may have been responsible for releasing. And then the other person, of course, is John Thorbjornsen, who was slated to come over and join us in this work. Here he is with some of the turtle people in March 2008. The work we've been doing is essentially natural history. And so we're very fortunate that it's been funded in large part by in-range country obligations and efforts on the parts of zoos, both American as well as European zoos. So here's the animal. It's a very distinctive species in this very spectacular Chambo River habitat, which we'll see more of. They have really large eggs, and as you can see, when they come out of the egg, already they have a very elongate snout. It continues to elongate right away. These are 2-week-old animals. They're almost exclusively, the species is almost exclusively fish-eating. They like to live in groups, and often those groups are mixed age and sex groups. Here's another male with young using his head as a basking platform. There really are only 2 populations in Nepal and 3 in India where gharials still live in the wild. And the 2 other populations in India at the Corbett National Park and at Katrini Ghat, which is on a barrage on a river that runs down from Nepal, are very small and strongly altered by this human activity. Essentially, they're reservoirs now, not river systems. So the Chambo River actually runs along the border of MP and is 9 times the volume of the Yamuna, but it joins the Yamuna, and so it's actually called a tributary of the Yamuna, even though when they join, it's mostly Chambo water that's flowing down. These other populations, there were historical records, but essentially there are 3 populations, and the only free-living population in a riverine system is this population on the Chambo. Fortunately, the Chambo is really an unholy river. Supposedly, blood ran in the river as a result of the slaughter of thousands of cattle. And so it's been underdeveloped. It's a very backward, quote-unquote, area, which is peopled by river villages and notoriously home of bandits and dacoits, the most famous of which was Pulan Devi in the late 70s and 80s. Then she was put in prison. She was released from prison. She became a member of parliament. and then she was assassinated in the parliament. This is sort of a typical Indian story, I guess. Okay, the Chambal Sanctuary is a wild river and involves these 3 states as well as the central government in terms of some of the overall regulations and things. It's a self-sustaining population of gharial. It's also habitat for the freshwater dolphin, 2 species of hard-shelled and 2 species of soft-shelled turtles. The Chitra and Gangeticus get to be almost a meter across, and it's a major migratory bird flyway for birds. So there was an initial effort with head starting, collecting eggs and then releasing those back into the wild in the 70s through the 90s. And then there was kind of a lack of interest in crocodilians in general, because even though there were these very successful managed efforts to conserve them, it turned out there was very little habitat in which to actually release the animals that had started. And when studies were done in the mid 2003 and 4 and then 5, it turned out that the numbers of adults that were seen, and the only way they studied this animal was essentially go down the river in February and count the animals. And then in some years they went down and they counted nests. So there was very little known about actually what the animals were doing in between times. There was a marked decline in the numbers that were counted in the late 90s and early 2000s, and also a dramatic decline in the number of nests that were noted. So that resulted in, John Thorbjornson actually was involved in some of these efforts to critically, or to uplist the animal to critically endangered in 2007. But then there was this double whammy, because in the winter of 2007, December, and the first 2 months of 2008, January and February, there was a massive die-off, and the carcasses started floating up of animals that were 2 to 4 meters in length. And there were 110 plus carcasses that were noted in the lower section of the Chambal River. So that was the reason that we got involved in this study. I talked with Ram Whitaker and Basu, and we basically said, let's try and use this opportunity to learn more about what the species is doing. And particularly because there were sort of just so stories about the animals might have been going down to the Yamuna, feeding on tainted fish. We just didn't know anything about sort of what they were doing in between these times when they were out basking in February and where they nested. So we wanted to know what effect did the die-off of this 110 animals possibly have. Just basically provide more solid natural history. Again, try to come up with some explanation of why the die-off happened and how it might have affected the population overall. And I'd worked in India earlier in, from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, and knew enough about the way the Indian system worked to realize that this might be one unusual opportunity to get our foot in the door, so to speak. Everyone felt they had to do something. So the state forest departments were particularly sensitive and more than willing to sort of say, okay, if you think you can provide us with some information, please help, because they were all sort of in the hot seat, so to speak. So we wanted to look at various aspects of its behavioral ecology. And my background is in behavior, so I just want to point out that, understanding the behavior is probably very helpful in this kind of situation. It's not just a surface feature. We know that it's intimately connected to the physiology, the reproductive status, and all the rest of that sort of stuff. It helps link the animal to its habitat. There have been a number of studies on the Chambal looking at the depth of the water and the height of the sandbanks. But the other important thing is that where the other gharial are can be equally important, this whole idea of conspecific attraction. So when you're trying to explain why an animal is where it is, you might want to also understand something about the social context. So we wanted to look primarily at spatial ecology and how the animals were moving around, with the idea of how do we understand how much of the river the individual animal is using? So these animals live a long time, probably have a lifespan like people. And in that 30, 40, 50 years, half of which is the time when it's reproducing, how much of the river is the animal using? And the other thing, of course, then is to understand more about the social context and some of the features of the reproductive ecology. We use telemetry, and here this is a really hard species to catch because you can't bait them. Most other crocodilians, you can take half a dog hanging in the back of a rope trap, and it's not difficult compared to gharial. But gharial are exclusively fish eaters, and so we have to try to net them. But the other thing is they're really good. By the time they get to be 3, 4, 5 meters, they're really good at negotiating nets. So this was a problem. This is quite a challenge. It still is. Here, when we did catch animals, we could put radios on them. So here we've sutured. We also used some of the initial work that John Thorbjornsen had done attaching transmitters to Chinese alligators. We've modified it a little bit. And then we can get out in this very open habitat. These are just VHF manual signals, and we can do telemetry. We initially tried to use boats, but the animals dove. And so when they dive, they go below a meter below the surface, and you can't hear the signal. So what we tried to do then was just access the river using motorbikes and footpaths and get up on the high ground, very open habitat. And we used the telemetered animals essentially as indicators of what the whole population was doing. So when we would go out to do a location of the telemetered animals, we would also do total basking counts of animals in different size categories. And the telemetered animals in our initial group represented about 1/10 of the animals that we counted in total. We did the study. When we first got permission, they said you can do, we asked for a lot of animals. They couldn't understand that. They said, why don't you just do 5? We said we wanted to do 30. So then we compromised, and they said, well, you can do 10, but you can catch 10. You'll probably kill 4. You can catch 10, and so we did 10 for 2.5 years and didn't kill any, and learned something about these animals in this 2 to 4 meter size class. And then we did 10 more for 2.5 years. So we did 5 years, about 20 animals. And that's primarily, those are the animals that I'm going to be talking about, but we've also gone on and done some additional tagging, which I'll mention in a minute. I've mentioned something about the telemetry methodology. We patterned our observations. We spread our observations throughout the whole year, and we patterned the observations in a way that tracked the seasonal activities. So if you're trying to do the telemetry, you go out in the middle of the day during the winter time when the animals are basking, and early in the morning and late in the afternoon at the hotter times of year, etc. In 2013, in November, we were able to tag 2 adult females out of 20. We tagged 20 more animals. And then we also got permission to do mugger crocodiles. Because mugger were living in the same system but had not experienced the die-off. And very little is actually known about mugger natural history, even though it's a very common species across all of India. So we were able to get 2 adults, and then we caught what we call a junior male. He had a very small gara, but he was 4.3 meters with a slightly shortened tail. And this is a picture of him. And in a minute, you'll see how not to release a 4.3 meter gharial. Now, this guy was particularly active. He hadn't been out of the water very long. He didn't get very tired when he was netted. And the critical point in the release is that the fisherman on the back jumped off on 1 rather than 3, and the guy on the front, who was an experienced crocodilian handler from the Croc Bank, stayed on until the count of 3, but we were lucky. From that point on, we always took a post and put it in near the snout so that the animal could not turn its head, because gharial notoriously are able to almost turn 360 degrees and touch their tail. This November 2014, we were able to tag 7 more larger animals, and with these we actually used GPS logging radio. So we have a manual VHF signal, and we also have a system that attempts to get some 10 to 15 readings a day using a GPS logging system that we can download at intervals. This was in 5.5 years ago. This was one of the animals in the initial group of 10. It was 2 meters in length and weighed about 35 kilos. And when we caught it this November, it measured 4 meters, but it still had just a tiny crease for a gara, and definitely was a male. We had a lot of discussion about whether it might have been a female, but it was clearly scute clipped, and we think it weighed about 350 kilos, about a 10 times increase in size in that 5.5, 6 year period. Then, in addition, that was the first day of our catching, and the fishermen had to be incredibly patient because we had to sit and wait on the nets, but we were also able to catch a big gara male. So this is sort of in the process. Here's the large gara, and here's his body. It took us 2.5, 3 hours just basically to lift him out of the water. Here's a foot, and the guy who was usually holding the snout couldn't even get his hands around the snout because it was fairly robust. So this guy was 5.3 meters, and we think weighed about 850 to 900 pounds. So we have tags on this animal, and it'll be very interesting to see what he does. Okay, so now this is the most exciting stuff, the reproductive ecology, especially that associated with nesting. So these are animals that nest during the dry season, and the hatching generally is timed to be coincident or occur just prior to the monsoon, the onset of the monsoon. So they nest in colonies, in large aggregations. The hatching happens pretty much at the same time, within a week to 10 days. Importantly, when the babies hatch, they actually form even larger groups. So if you have several nests, then they join together. In places where we have 10-plus nests, we have hundreds of babies. The average clutch size is about 35 to 45 young per nest. The parents are involved in defending the young, staying near the creches, and I'll talk initially about some of the female behavior. So the way we locate the nest to set up a game camera to look at sort of what's going on with nest opening, this is one species in which there wasn't much of a hint that the babies were being picked up in the mouth and carried to the water. In almost all other crocodilian species, the females and sometimes the males are involved in mouth transport of the young to the water. So we'll pound on the soil, and you can hear the young some 12 to 18 inches below the surface grunting. Oh, 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 oh. They'll respond within a day or two of when they're ready to hatch. So this is the female coming up, beginning to excavate. Now they nest in sand, and so other possible predators can also hear the young, and this is a time when jackals particularly are successful predating nests just before they hatch. Now here a female has spent an hour and a half to 2 hours, and she's excavating young, and you can see the young don't stay in the nest very long. So there was a baby that basically went from the front foot to the hind foot and then right out of the nest. So the young actually come from the middle of the nest or the edge of the nest, and they simply walk down to the water. Now in the distance you can see a few eggshells. This is the shoreline, and at the shoreline are a whole bunch of hatchlings that have assembled, as well as some adults. Here we can see 2 adults, females. This was a backwater. The main channel is on the other side of the sandbank. This is a fairly high sandbank, and there were 3 nests and then a 4th nest here. At the base of that nest, here's the female with some babies. And this was one of the local villagers who came in and said, I was sitting on this bank filming across, and he said, "This is usually where I do my laundry and take a bath and say my prayers. Is that okay?" And I said, "Of course." And so the point of showing this is that the gharial really couldn't have cared less that this guy was doing his daily duty, and vice versa. This is a group of young from 2 nests that hatched, and the female has just come over from mid-river. The reason she's come over is 2 river terns, this is a large species of Indian tern, were dive bombing the babies and had scared them into the water. And the female leapt up at the tern as it went over. Other wading birds are also potential predators. These are all babies. And you can see they're not wanting to stay near shore when this woolly-necked stork is approaching. Eventually, an adult surfaced, and the stork took off. Now, in this sequence, you can see there are young hatchlings here. And this is also a woolly-necked stork. And watch carefully what happens next. So it's primarily the females that seem to be evident close to the young in most situations. Here, this is a game camera shot. There's a fish swimming around. And these are young at night. And the female surfaces periodically. And then these are just a couple of still shots. Here is a female with some babies on her back. And the young, you can see their eyes reflect in the infrared of the game camera. So this female will come in, the same shot we saw earlier, and then early in the morning, you can see a female with a number of young, and the group is much tighter. So these guys move out in the middle of the, in the evening and at night, increasing distances from the center of the creche, which invariably does stay very close to where the actual nests have hatched. Now, what we'll look at is a 12-hour snapshot, essentially. And the reason for showing this is just to show that the female isn't there all the time, but she's there frequently. So she's coming and going. So sometimes she's there, sometimes she's not. And you can see she's assuming different positions. Often when she will approach, the young will vocalize in response to her approach. This species isn't particularly vocal, so it's not always, it's not evident exactly what signals the female may be sending to the young. But you can see the group now during the day is much more tightly clustered. So these are the 3 points that I mentioned earlier. The 4th point is, in this species, males are really heavily involved in defense of young. So now in the next video sequence, this is just a still. These are all young in the foreground. This was a situation where there were 30 nests, 28 of which hatched. So this is a very large group of young. And typically, this is early in the morning we would approach, and the male was not always there, but the male would usually be recruited. So within 5 minutes, you'd see the male coming from either downriver, upriver, or vice versa. So now we'll see some video sequences, and this is the typical kind of confrontational behavior that the male would engage in when we would approach a creche of young initially. So here's the male coming up, and then he just submerges and disappears. And the next time we see him, he's basically between me, standing here, and some of the young. Then he moves out. So you can see now some of the function of that gara is actually to sort of send that sound and increase how that sound is heard across this river valley. Sometimes the males then would come in close, and then he would turn around and go back out again. This male has come in and hit at the water surface twice. Now you might be able to hear a baby crawling in the background. Whoops. And here's a head slap with the animal off. The sound's a little out of sync, but so this is a particularly assertive confrontational behavior by the male. You can also see there's more subtle breathing, and these are all young on the male's back. This is early in the morning. Again, we don't really have a good idea. This species, like some of the other crocodilians, probably is producing sounds that are not very audible, possibly infrasound and other components. It's the freshwater dolphin that just surfaced. These are all young. The males do differ. This male was very cautious. He stayed out in the river, and actually a large group of young swam out the mid-river. And then some of them perched on his back. Here's a female, and this male has actually lost part of his garb, probably in a fight with another male. Here's a baby. He's, again, surfacing to show head, back, and tail to get some indication of size. And these young are very precocial. They actually can swim faster than some of these adults, and this is at a very young age, within a week or two of hatching. They're very, very good at managing the river. These are some crows that flew over. Here's the male in a somewhat more relaxed situation. Whoops. So it's possible then to just sit quietly, and actually the young then, these hatchlings will come out and begin basking, and this group of young on land will just advance forward as animals come behind them and come out of the water. So the males seem to stay with the young for a period of a month to 6 weeks. It depends on when the monsoon begins. This is just to show, again, the normal river activities are often quite compatible with the presence of some of these gharial. In this case, the gharial nested quite close to where the villagers came down every day to take their baths and do their laundry. And here you'll see, actually. So here's an older man and a little kid taking a bath. Here's a big male gharial, 5 meters plus. And here, hidden, you'll see in a minute, here's this little probably 2 or 3 year old coming out, not too concerned. And then there's a lady back here doing her washing, and she just emerges as soon as so pretty much, okay, well this is just, and this just happens. This is very normal, that there can be normal river activity. In this particular case, a little bit later in this sequence, somebody came right down closer to the young, and then the male and female got involved. Here's the male and the female. So sometimes there's some cooperation. There was a pond heron that was sneaking up on the young from the other side. So there were villagers on one side of the group of young and a pond heron on the other. So the female went over and did some very subtle bubbling, but basically the heron got the message and flew up and ended up back up higher up on the bank. And we have a couple of other instances. There were 3 fishing eagles, juvenile fishing eagles, that were attacking a pod of young, and both the male and the female, here's the female with the young on her head, came in together. but this is rather unusual. Usually you see one or the other parent. So the females will actually stay with the group until the monsoon waters really cause a dramatic change in the water levels. The young begin to feed right away. Here's a young feeding on fish of various sizes. And this just shows a bank. The nests were not too far away, and this is some month plus, and the young are scattered out along here. You can see some of them feeding. This one has swallowed a fish, there's another one. And this is what they're feeding on, small fish that are driven by big fish into the shallows. These are gharial that are actually with their tail up on the shoreline, and their mouths agape. And basically those little fish are being driven into their mouths. So then the monsoon comes, and when the monsoon comes, the adults move downstream very rapidly. In this case, this movement of some 30 or 40 kilometers only took about 4 or 5 days, and then the last 12 hours involved, just a 12-hour, 30-kilometer movement in the evening down to the confluence where the animal was found the next morning. So this happens pretty rapidly. The adults tend to hang around the confluence. So this is the Yamuna coming from Delhi through Agra and then on down and meeting the Chambal here. And this is the Chambal system that we did most of these studies in. We were actually based at a village up around this area, up here. Okay, so the females as well as males come down and spend time around the confluence. This is what they were doing. This is the Chambal in flood, quite muddy, and you can see there's a boundary here. The Yamuna is in the foreground. And what happens is the animals move along this turbulent boundary with their mouths agape. This is a small male. You can see just the hint of a gar there. And this is just a tiny video of you can see the boundary is actually quite visible here. And here's an animal that has just crossed and then is turning around to go back up. Here's an animal actually swimming down along that edge. And so this is when we actually see a lot of active feeding, and we've spent hundreds of hours observing gharial at other times, especially during the winter months, and rarely see them feeding. So we're not really sure yet, but it looks very much like the energy acquisition is probably very asymmetrical. It occurs primarily during 2 or 3 of the warm monsoon months when the fish are breeding and there's a lot of aquatic habitat. And the temperatures are very permissive for processing food. And then, over a period of weeks or months, the animals move from the confluence back upstream. And these upstream movements are more relaxed, but they also involve quite far distances. So in this case, this is 100 kilometers plus. And we have individual animals that have routinely done this every year. So they, during the dry season, move upstream and then come downstream during the monsoon and back up again. We had 3 females in that initial group of 20, and one of them in particular, we have a nest site for her every year, plus an additional 4th year, even after the radio was no longer functioning. And this was a very typical pattern of her as an individual, but also of the other 2 reproductive-sized females. It's very likely that this female, for instance, just moved out of range. We just weren't looking widely enough up or down river. So the other thing is that the subadults show very different kinds of movements. The subadults seem to be very sedentary. They don't move very much either up or down, depending on the monsoon or the dry season. So we have 4 animals that in this case have only moved less than 20 kilometers. And in some cases, the actual typical movement was more on the order of 5 kilometers, even though on occasion they journeyed a little bit further up or downstream. And so those animals actually had a very different spatial use, and importantly, they didn't actually move down to the confluence as far as we can tell. So this, we think, might relate to the die-off scenario, and this is a scenario in which 4 crocodilian or vets that were well versed in crocodilian biology converged on the die-off scene and attempted to collect samples, and were able to find that gout, both articular and visceral gout, were evident in the animals that they were able to autopsy. And the pattern of deaths was clustered in this upper area, some 50 or 60 kilometers from the confluence, and occurred over a period of 12 weeks, but actually most of the deaths occurred in the first 4 to 5 weeks. And so we still don't really know the answer to this particular question. It looks more like it was toxin than related to an infectious agent, but it was very gharial specific. It didn't affect mugger, didn't affect the turtles, didn't affect the birds. It happened pretty fast, and also it was localized, and importantly, it was localized at some distance from the confluence. So now we're still trying to piece together what these smaller animals are doing, but we do have some tags on some small meter to 2 meter sized animals. And what we think is happening is that rather than move up and down, they're actually moving laterally. So when the river comes up in flood, now this is a river that's sort of the size of, I grew up in St. Louis, it's the size of the Mississippi River. It's a mile from side to side in some cases. It typically is 300 kilometers to 500 kilometers across, and meters, not kilometers. And during the monsoon, the rise in water is on the order of 25 to 30 feet, some 7 to 8 meters. So there's a massive flow of water, but the area is quite heavily dissected with these right-angle canyons that dump into the river, and those flood. They fill up with water, as well as a lot of shallow water along the tableland at different levels as the river rises. And so those might be very important retreats and might particularly make the Chombo a good river that provides that refuge from the main flow. We don't find adults in the main flow of the river at all. The adults avoid the river when it's in full flood. This is a shot showing, so one of the things that we've been able to do is work out the seasonal pattern of activity. So the late dry season activity in midwinter essentially is large groups of basking animals, as many as 30 to, in some cases, almost 90 animals of mixed ages. This is a shot showing an unusual assemblage of males, such that you can see here's a male with a full gara. This may actually be the male that we put the radio on. Here is a male with an intermediate-sized gara, another male with a slightly smaller gara, and another male in the foreground with just a little nubbin of a gara here, and then this guy swims around to the back, and so you can kind of see some of these from a slightly different angle. This is sort of a male feature that seems to develop between 4 to 4.5 meters, and we yet don't fully understand how the gara develops and what the conditions are that results in the development of these large gara. But we see typically large animals sometimes basking together, and then that gives way to a much more assertive behavior on the part of some of the big males. This is a male that's just chased another male away and is sort of punctuating the fact that he's become the dominant animal by thrashing his tail deliberately from side to side. So this is a social signal characteristic of these big large gara males. And here you'll see another display of one of the large gara males, essentially body surfing along in front in a very obvious display of sort of size and power. The same thing here. There were a number of animals basking on the shore, including a smaller gara male. And this is a male. This is just a still. Here's the actual video. Fortunately, the audio you couldn't hear, but I'm sort of saying, like, what the hell's going on, because I'm not exactly sure what was going to happen. These are very explosive events. So the animals assemble in these large groups, and then breeding occurs. The dominant male often displays, and now this is just a sequence to show courtship and probably a copulation between a large gara male.
It's not a very big female, is it?
A small female.
Huh? The female's big?
This is in fairly
Oh,
shallow
there we go.
water.
My goodness.
And here's the male's snout and his body. He's riding on top of the female, and in a minute you can see their tails. Here's the female's snout, barely visible. So breeding occurs in late February, early March, and then nesting occurs in late March, early April. And what happens with the breeding groups, we think individual females may be visiting different breeding groups. Typically, a dominant male will set up in a particular area with a number of subdominant males off to the margins. The females that are receptive seem to approach the dominant male. And they breed over a period of a day or two. The male breeds with one female and then another. But the females we've seen at different breeding assemblages. And then the females break up into smaller groups. And they dig trial nests. They open nests in the side of particularly steep sandbanks with deep water at the base. That's sort of the typical preferred nesting situation, not on the tops, but on the 2/3 to 3/4 up the sides of these steep banks. Sometimes the nests are left open for a few days, and then eggs are laid in some of the nest cavities, and they're closed and then guarded. Nesting, importantly, occurs. We have 5 years of nesting, and I'm just going to go through these very quickly. These are different nest sites with the number of nests at each site. But the main take-home message here is that it's quite variable. For instance, in this year we had only 6 sites, but there were 30 nests at one site and 20 nests at another site. So this is important from a conservation standpoint, because people are always trying to say, okay, let's just protect this 2 or 3 kilometers of river. This is where the animals nest. But we know from our movement studies that at least individual females don't always nest in the same place from year to year. And also the river topography, the monsoon changes the river. So as the river changes, then the suitable sites for nesting change. The females pick those. And we're not really sure what's going on with the dominant males in terms, it looks like they're patrolling certain sections of the river, and if If they're going to be the main breeder, it's because the river has created suitable nesting habitat in their particular area that they control. So these are just some of the numbers. This is from upstream to downstream, and so this is about 160 kilometers from the confluence, about 130 kilometers of area that we have identified as good nesting habitat. A couple of take-home things. One is that places where there are only a few nests, we seem to lose more nests. They're either predated more often or they're disturbed, and there are fewer hatchlings produced. And then this is the number of nests, and this is the number of nests that produced hatchlings. So we have only 2 sites out of these 21 over the 5 years that had nests and hatchlings every year, this one and this one. And you can see there's a lot of variation in between. And then in the nests that are shown here in these blue boxes, these are all the instances we have of large Gara males guarding hatchlings, hatchling groups. And these are the number of nests that hatched. So we have some large percentage, by far the majority of the nests associated with guarding males. 30 instances that probably involve at least 15 individual males. And the general pattern is a lot of nests and a guarding male means low predation and vice versa. There are 2 interesting examples that I want to mention. One is where a male a successful male was displaced. And this is the male we saw in the video earlier. So he was the main breeder and the main attendant guardian during 2010 when there were 11 nests, in 2011 when there were 20 nests. And he was the main breeding animal when there were 30 nests, but he was displaced between the time when the animals bred and the time when the animals nested by a larger animal, which was the one that we saw in some of the other video. He was a super aggressive male. Here he is kind of tuckered out. He apparently was involved in some fights. There were a lot of very obvious injuries that seemed to be bite marks that we think were associated with combat with this male, which disappeared. This male, who we don't think was the dominant parent in 2012, was the guardian male with the 28 nests that hatched in 2012. Obviously, we need to do the genetic test to sort of pin this down, but it's suggestive that, at least in some cases, the guardian male is not necessarily the presumptive parent. And here's a situation where we had this junior male. We did follow this animal in the breeding group that he was associated with quite closely and saw no instances of his being involved in the breeding. But he turned out to be the dominant guardian male. And again, there's only one male with these creches. We haven't seen any creches that have more than one male. And he was the dominant guardian male at a group, fairly large group of 13 nests that hatched. Here's the female. So what we think might be happening then is the guarding male actually, it's really a question of, is it really the present parent or possibly a future parent? And I think at least in these 2 cases, it looks like what we have going on here might be something fairly complex for reptiles that involves protective behavior by other than a parent, which is referred to as alloparental behavior in things like primates and quite a number of bird species. The last intriguing bit of information here that we don't know very much about is we see these 9-month-old yearlings, almost a year old, hanging out with big dominant males around the time of nesting. Here's one of these small guys. Now, the typical situation just before nesting is the females are sort of staging. They're spending a lot of time basking. So we've got 8 females basking here, 6 of which ended up nesting down in here. And the male actually is patrolling. So he's acting as a sentinel. So if there's any disturbance, the male will display and then typically will display at the end when the disturbance has abated, when the group of cattle that have come down to feed at the water's edge or some other disturbance, sand miners have come and gone. This is the dominant male, so he's set himself aside. He's either downstream or upstream from the basking group of females. And these are some large water birds, which the male comes over to confront as they move down toward the water. And here's the male displaying to a yearling, one of these 9-month-old animals. And we actually watch the dominant male move along the bank systematically, presumably searching for these smaller animals, and then he would do some obvious display, not always a full display like this, when the small animal was encountered or within sighting distance. And these small animals would preferentially haul out near the large male when he was basking, and he would also seek them out. So we're not sure exactly what's going on there. So here are the findings, which I won't read, just throw them up here. And of course, we think this is a pretty spectacular situation, and it's very important that we try to maintain the river in its state, and that's part of the reason for doing these long-term studies with animals that are using a big chunk of the river. It's probably time to really start refocus our attention on the river itself. This is sort of we're halfway through. There's still a few of these efforts being made, but an increased effort on the river itself. And again, it's important to understand that if you're going to release animals, so one of the programs has released subadult animals in 20 kilometers of protected area on the Ganges. But there's only 20 kilometers of protected area. And that's probably fine now when the animals are smaller, but it might not be enough protection when the animals become mature. So with that, I want to just acknowledge the Crocodile Bank is where we did most of this work. Forest departments were more or less cooperative. Here are the guys. This is Pankaj. Pankaj has really been sort of the linchpin of the study. He goes out with Ramraj, so these guys are the trackers. Deepu is our kind of man Friday who helps us keep the base together and also does all the driving. Pankaj was the one that originally noted the male behavior. This is a local who crossed the river with 3 of his buddies and kind of came running up, and here are all these babies out in the middle of the river, and he said, "Why did you put all these babies in the river? We don't want these gharial in here. They eat all our fish." And so there's some efforts underway to try to, work with the communities. These are very, very poor, low-caste villages, really at subsistence level. We work with the Turtle Survival Alliance, who have a similar program on a couple of the endangered turtles. We've gotten a lot of support from the Prague Zoo that put this booklet together. It's quite attractive, but it's also in Hindi, of course. And then they do little skits and community things. Here's a bird waiting in the wings and a shepherd, and the bird says to the shepherd, "Don't cut all my trees because I need some place to nest." And here's a turtle saying, "Don't take all my sand, you sand miners, because I need sand to nest in." And the gharial is saying, "Don't put nets in the water because you're going to catch me and all the fish." So that's the end of the story. Thanks very much. Yep.
I wondered if you had any indication that the mothers were suppressing their recovery.
No, and that's been, there have actually been people that have come in, and Bob Bustard, who was with the UNDP program early on and helped set up this whole crocodile group in India in the early 70s, has actually said, kill all the muggers in the Chambal, just, without any particular evidence. So the one thing that's very obvious is the muggers that get, basically muggers are like kind of Asian alligators in a way. I mean, they occur in almost all the wetlands. They're about the same size and shape. They don't get to be all that big. The adult muggers absolutely avoid the adult gharial. They'll actually, if they pass them on the river, they'll actually go to the opposite riverbank. They hang out in slightly different areas. They like the rocks and the muddy areas. But interestingly, they nest. Some of the mugger will put their nests in with gharial nests, but then they skedaddle right away. So the mugger hatch, and the mama has the babies, and they're gone within 24 hours. So people have speculated the mugger, which eat anything they can get their mouth around, could easily predate these younger gharial. And they probably do to some extent, but the data is just inconclusive. We just don't really know, but it's likely that card is being overplayed, in my opinion, in a situation like this, where there are mugger, but there haven't been dramatic increases in the number of mugger. And the mugger do use the habitat in slightly different ways. They dig caves during the monsoon as the water dries down. They use these caves to retreat in. And they're eating a much broader variety of stuff than the gharial are. So in this situation, I don't think they're having strong detrimental effects on the gharial. In a more tenuous situation where you have fewer gharial, that might be the case. Yep.
You mentioned the lateral movement of the gharial, and when they do that, they strictly use the channels, or do they also occupy ponds, and for how long?
Well, these little tributaries that come in are called nullahs, and they've been observed up in those nullahs. So they go some distance from the main river, and on occasion they're actually villagers will call and say, "Well, we've got this weird crocodile in our pond," and then they go and they do the forest department tries to do a rescue, and it's often a young gharial. So and actually the Yamuna and the Chambo, you can see there are places where there's almost less than a kilometer between the bends in the river, and it's dissected ravine on everything but the road that we use, and it looks like animals probably move around quite a bit during that high monsoon when there's a lot of water, and maybe in former times when they're even higher densities, dispersed that way. But they don't seem to stay there. They don't even though they do okay in places like Corbett where there's a reservoir, still water, and at Katrina Ugat, it causes problems, especially because these are usually altered systems, so the water's drawn down. So what happens is they pick a nesting site, and then the water goes down, and the nest is either too far from water or it's too far from water in both directions, vertical as well as horizontal, as the finger dries down. So, but it's really a big river species, and they use all that aquatic habitat, I think, but don't really venture too far from the big rivers.
Okay, so
Yeah.
one more quick
Yeah.
question, if you don't mind. I know you thought about this a lot. What would you say? What's your best guess about the future of gharial? Probably better than a few years ago.
Well, we have to be optimistic and hopeful, right? But there are two main threats, and one is water extraction. So this is a really pure river, and it's got a huge volume of fresh water. And there are a lot of people in India. Now, fortunately, there's very little industrial development on the river. There's actually one stretch way, way up where there's a gap of like some 5 kilometers in the sanctuary. And it turns in there's a leather tannery effluent coming in from a tributary, and that happened at the time the river was set up. And apparently there are mugger there that are almost like white. But anyway, so the two main threats are water extraction, and the bigger threat right now, because the present Indian government is actually very pro-development, are dams. And so there have been a series of dams proposed, and then they've been fought back by the Ministry of Environment and Forests and some of the other influential NGOs. but that pressure will continue to take water out of the river, which is going to make it, it's basically a series of deep pools and shallow water. And so what will happen is we'll turn this thing eventually, what will happen is it'll turn into almost like a billabong situation where you have deep pools and then almost no way to connect. So those are the two main challenges that I see. The slightly positive thing is that this is a very impoverished area. It's not particularly developed. For instance, when we want to take boats down, there are only a few places where we can even access the river to put an inflatable boat in. So the development has been very, very slow, and it'll just be a matter of whether there's going to be enough teeth in the protection. The freshwater dolphins are critically endangered species. The Indian skimmer is primarily only seen in this river. So there are a handful of high-profile, critically endangered species, but whether they're going to keep the forces at bay is an open question. There have been good, fairly positive changes in the environmental management within the Indian system of the Forest Department, for instance. There are a lot of younger people. They're getting more biology, so we can be hopeful. I always like to think of the amount of resources in India. The people are the resources. So if we could have, 10 pankages or 100 pankages, going up and down the river, keeping an eye out for the gharial, there's no question that the fact that he's a regular visitor has made everyone a little more aware. That some people have said, why didn't you just do satellite telemetry? A lot easier. You could just, you don't have to. But it's that daily presence of somebody actually there, sort of paying attention to the animal, and we're going to try and work in some of the villages to encourage that and keep it going, because there are a lot of really well-qualified people, and it's just a matter of putting them to good use, I guess. Okay. Thanks.
Maybe one last question.
Oh, sorry.
The river, has it had, over the course of your studies, does it have any change in the salinity, temperature, or, that's what I was going to ask, but has there been any changes and such?
Over
the course of your studies?
We haven't actually been, I have to confess, we haven't been monitoring those sorts of parameters. There are environmental monitoring systems in place to look at some of those things. The only take-home message I can give after doing, we started in 2008, and so we have 6-7 years, is that if we hadn't done a longer-term study, we'd have no appreciation for how dynamic